Deep in an ancient forest, where the trees intertwined in a thick, dark canopy, lived a woman named Elena. Her home was far from the hustle and bustle of the modern world, surrounded by the calm of the forest. Elena was a solitary writer, finding inspiration in the nature that surrounded her. However, her quiet life was abruptly interrupted when anonymous letters began to arrive. At first, the letters were harmless, just a few compliments on her work and her beauty. But soon they became more insistent, more personal. They described in detail her daily life, her routines, her innermost thoughts. Elena felt uncomfortable at first, but decided to ignore them, thinking it was a lonely admirer and not something more sinister. However, the letters were not the only indication that something was wrong. Elena began to notice shadows moving through the trees as she walked through the woods, and she had a constant feeling that someone was watching her. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but the uneasy feeling persisted. One night, as she sat at her desk, writing in the dim light of a lamp, she heard a noise outside the window. At first, she thought it was just the wind playing among the tree branches, but then she heard a whisper, a soft, ominous whisper that made her skin crawl. She got up from her chair and walked over to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. In the darkness, she could barely make out the figure of a man standing among the trees, staring at her. Her breathing became rapid and shallow as she slowly backed away, unable to look away from those eyes watching her from the darkness. When she was finally able to look away, the man had disappeared, but the fear remained. Elena locked herself in her house, securing the doors and windows, but she knew she would not be safe. The stalker had found her, and he wasn't going to rest until he had her in his hands. The nights became a torment for Elena, with every little noise making her jump out of bed. She spent the sleepless hours, her heart hammering in her chest, waiting for the next attack. But the stalker was cunning and knew how to play with her mind. The letters kept coming, each one more threatening than the last. The stalker described his darkest fantasies, his most perverse desires, in great detail. Elena tried to destroy them, but more kept appearing, as if the stalker was everywhere, watching her every moment. Desperate, Elena decided to seek help, but soon discovered that she was alone. No one in town seemed willing to believe her story, thinking she was exaggerating or making it all up. She felt trapped in a nightmare from which she could not wake up, with the stalker lurking in every shadow. One night, the stalker decided to take action. He broke down the door of Elena's house and entered, a malevolent smile on his face. Elena tried to run away, but the stalker caught her before she could reach the door. He grabbed her tightly and dragged her into the woods, where no one could hear her scream. Elena fought with all her might, clawing and kicking, but the stalker was too strong. He dragged her further and further into the heart of the forest, where the shadows closed over them like claws. Elena knew she was lost, that she would never see daylight again. But then, in a moment of desperation, she managed to break free and ran into the darkness, without looking back. She ran and ran, fear burning in her veins, until she finally emerged from the forest, free at last. But she knew the stalker was still out there, waiting in the shadows, waiting for his next opportunity to strike. And she knew she would never be safe as long as he continued to lurk in the darkness. Deep in a dark and desolate city, where the neon lights flickered like dying stars and the streets were filled with twisted shadows, lived a man named Mark. Mark was a solitary and withdrawn individual who spent his days in the darkness of his apartment, cut off from the outside world. From a young age, Mark had felt a twisted attraction to the people around him. He became obsessed with those he considered perfect, admiring their beauty and apparent happiness from a distance. But his admiration soon turned into an unhealthy obsession, and Mark began to follow his targets, secretly observing them and fantasizing about their perfect life. At first, his actions went unnoticed, but soon his victims began to notice his lurking presence. Mark fed off the fear and discomfort he caused, feeling powerful knowing he had control over them. But his thirst for dominance and possession only grew over time, leading him down a dark and twisted path. Mark began sending anonymous letters to his targets, filled with obsessive declarations of love and detailed descriptions of their daily lives. He reveled in the fear and confusion he caused, taking a perverse pleasure in watching his victims squirm under his influence. But that was not enough for him. Soon, Mark began to escalate in his quest for power and control. He began to break into the homes of his victims, hiding in the shadows and watching them as they slept. He reveled in the fear they felt as they awoke to find they were not alone, knowing he was there, waiting in the dark. But the real climax of his depravity came when Mark decided to take his obsession to the next level. He began kidnapping his victims, locking them in his apartment, and subjecting them to all kinds of physical and psychological torture. He fed off their suffering, enjoying every scream of pain and every tear shed. However, the more he immersed himself in his depravity, the emptier Mark felt inside. Despite all his power and control over his victims, he still felt a deep sense of loneliness and despair. He wondered if he would ever find the peace he so longed for, or if he was doomed to live in darkness forever. One day, while stalking his next victim in the shadows of the night, Mark sensed a presence behind him. He turned sharply, but no one was there. However, he felt a cold, uneasy feeling run down his back, as if he was being watched by more than just human eyes. As the days passed, the feeling of being watched intensified, until Mark began to feel a constant presence around him. He became paranoid, unable to distinguish between fact and fiction, convinced that something was chasing him in the shadows. Finally, one dark and stormy night, while stalking his latest victim in the deserted streets of the city, Mark felt a cold, ghostly hand close around his neck. He tried to scream, but could make no sound. He looked up and saw a dark, twisted figure emerging from the shadows, eyes glowing with an unearthly light. In an instant, Mark knew he had been trapped by something far darker and more evil than he was. He realized that all of his ruthless and depraved actions had brought him to this moment, and that he would now have to face the consequences of his actions. The figure dragged him into the darkness, where he disappeared without a trace. Since then, no one has seen Mark or his victims again. Some say he was punished for his sins and condemned to wander for eternity in darkness, while others believe he was taken to the underworld to face an even more terrible punishment. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Mark's story serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of obsession and unbridled power, and how evil can manifest itself in the most insidious and terrifying ways. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, there lived a woman named Emily. Emily appeared to be a kind and helpful neighbor, always ready to help her neighbors with a smile on her face. However, behind that facade of kindness hid a dark secret. Emily was a stalker. It all started as a simple fascination with her neighbor, Sarah, a young single mother who lived across the street. Emily was drawn to Sarah's seemingly perfect life, admiring her beauty and her strength in raising her son. But her admiration soon turned into an unhealthy obsession, and Emily began following Sarah everywhere, secretly watching her and plotting how to get closer to her. At first, her actions went unnoticed, but soon Sarah began to notice Emily's lurking presence around her. Emily fed off the fear and discomfort she caused, enjoying the power she felt knowing she had control over Sarah's life. But that wasn't enough for her. Emily began sending anonymous gifts to Sarah, filled with obsessive declarations of love and intimate details about her daily life. She reveled in the fear and confusion she caused, enjoying the chaos she created in her victim's life. But that wasn't enough for her either. Soon, Emily decided to take her obsession to the next level. She began breaking into Sarah's house when she was away, snooping through her belongings and leaving clues of her presence behind her. He reveled in Sarah's fear at discovering she wasn't alone, relishing every moment of suffering he inflicted on her. But the real climax of her depravity came when Emily decided to kidnap Sarah and her son. She kept them prisoner in her basement, subjecting them to all kinds of physical and psychological torture. She fed on their suffering, enjoying the sound of their screams and the smell of their fear. However, the more she immersed herself in their depravity, the emptier Emily felt inside. Despite all her power and control over Sarah, she still felt a deep sense of loneliness and despair. She wondered if she would ever find the peace she so longed for, or if she was doomed to live in darkness forever. One day, as she stalked her next victim in the shadows of the night, Emily sensed a presence behind her. She turned sharply, but no one was there. However, she felt a cold, uneasy feeling run down her back, as if she was being watched by more than just human eyes. As the days passed, the feeling of being watched intensified, until Emily began to feel a constant presence around her. She became paranoid, unable to distinguish between fact and fiction, convinced that something was haunting her in the shadows. Finally, one dark and stormy night, while stalking her latest victim in the deserted streets of the neighborhood, Emily felt a cold, ghostly hand close around her neck. She tried to scream, but couldn't make a sound. She looked up and saw a dark, twisted figure emerging from the shadows, eyes glowing with an unearthly light. In an instant, Emily knew she had been trapped by something far darker and more evil than herself. She realized that all her ruthless and depraved actions had brought her to this moment, and that she would now have to face the consequences of her actions. The figure dragged her into the darkness, where it disappeared without a trace. Since then, no one has seen Emily or her victims again. Some say she was punished for her sins and condemned to wander for eternity in darkness, while others believe she was taken to the underworld to face an even more terrible punishment. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Emily's story serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of obsession and unbridled power, and how evil can manifest itself in the most insidious and terrifying ways. Deep in an ancient and shadowy forest, where the trees stood like petrified giants and the shadows danced in the wind, lurked a monstrous being known as the Night Stalker. This being was a creature of darkness, a manifestation of all of mankind's most horrible nightmares and deepest fears. The Night Stalker fed on the fear and despair of those who dared venture into its territory. For centuries, it had been an ominous presence in the forest, ensnaring the unsuspecting in its razor-sharp claws and dragging them into the depths of darkness. One night, as a young girl named Mia walked through the forest in search of medicinal herbs for her ailing mother, the Night Stalker watched her from the shadows. His eyes glowed with a malevolent light as he followed Mia's every step, waiting for the right moment to strike. Mia, oblivious to the danger around her, continued on her way, carefully gathering the herbs she needed. But as the sun began to set and the shadows lengthened, a shiver ran down her spine. She felt as if she was being watched, as if something was stalking her in the shadows. Then the Night Stalker emerged from the trees, its eyes glowing like burning embers in the darkness. Mia recoiled in horror as the creature slowly approached, its claws outstretched and its mouth full of sharp teeth. She tried to flee, but the Night Stalker was much faster. It grabbed her tightly and dragged her into the depths of the forest, where the shadows closed over them like a funeral shroud. Mia screamed for help, but her cries were lost in the silence of the night. For days, Mia was a prisoner of the Night Stalker, trapped in a world of darkness and despair. The creature fed on her fear and suffering, enjoying the sound of her screams and the smell of her terror. But Mia refused to give in to the monster that had captured her. With courage and determination, she sought a way to escape from her dark prison. She used all her skills and cunning to trick the Night Stalker, seeking a way out of the shadows that surrounded her. Finally, after a long and arduous battle, Mia managed to free herself from the Night Stalker's clutches. She ran towards the sunlight, feeling the comforting warmth on her skin as she escaped from the depths of the forest. As she emerged from the forest, Mia looked back one last time, watching the Night Stalker disappear into the darkness. She knew she would never be completely safe from the creature that had pursued her, but she also knew it was stronger than she had ever imagined. From then on, Mia never went into the forest at night again. But every time she closed her eyes, she could still feel the presence of the Night Stalker lurking in the shadows, reminding her that evil is always lurking, waiting for its next opportunity to strike.